We are studying fracture clavicle classification, which is known as Allman's classification, which has three groups, and group 2 is further divided by Neer's classification. Understanding the anatomy is important here, starting from the medial end, the coracoid process, the glenoid cavity, the acromion process over the lateral end, which articulates with the lateral end of the clavicle, which is further supported by the acromioclavicular ligaments. The distal clavicle contains coracoclavicular ligaments. The medial one is known as conoid, whereas the lateral one is known as trapezoid. Both will provide vertical stability to distal part of the clavicle. Let us look at Allman's classification. Group 1 affects the middle part of the clavicle. Group 2 affects the distalmost part of the clavicle, whereas Group 3 involve proximal part of the clavicle. In Group 1 fractures, which is the middle part of the clavicle, both proximal and distal ends are secured, and so these fractures tend to be minimally displaced and can be treated conservatively. Group 2, which is divided by Neer's classification, has Type 1, Type 2, which is again of two types, and Type 3 based on position of the fracture relative to the coracoclavicular ligaments. Type 1 is an interligamentous fracture occurring either between the acromioclavicular and the CC ligaments or between the two coracoclavicular ligaments. In either case, the ligaments are intact, and so these fractures tend to be minimally displaced. When we look at Group 2 fractures, fracture here lies medial to the coracoclavicular ligaments, and it is further subdivided based on which coracoclavicular ligament remains intact. In Type 2A, both conoid and trapezoid remain intact, and the fracture line here is medial to both conoid and trapezoid ligaments. Whereas in Type 2B, the conoid is torn, whereas the trapezoid remains intact. Here, the proximal segment will have the torn conoid, whereas the distal segment will still have the trapezoid attached. In Group 2 fractures, the medial end of the clavicle remains unstable, and hence these are likely to need surgical intervention. These are also known to have higher incidences of non-union. Group 3 are intra-articular fractures of the distal clavicle involving the acromioclavicular joint, where the ligaments are still intact. Such fractures are less likely to be displaced. Group 3 are fractures of the medial part of the clavicle are divided into 5 types. Type 1 is minimally displaced, whereas Type 2 is displaced. Type 3 involves intra-articular area. Type 4 has epiphyseal separation, whereas Type 5 is comminuted. If the costoclavicular ligaments remain intact, these fractures are likely to be minimally displaced.